Hi everybody, hope you're having a great fall break. I wanted to, as I told you I would, cover chapters 4 and 12 that we just went over last week. These, however, will not be on the midterm. They're going to be on the final exam, but I want to cover those concepts and terms. So if you want to grab your study guide and follow along, that'd be great. So in the chapter 4 on arousal, anxiety, and stress, we first need to understand that arousal runs on a continuum from on the low end of the spectrum, where you're almost like in a state of a coma, to on the other end of the spectrum, you're in a wild frenzy. And as we've talked a lot about, we try to get our athletes, get these individuals in the flow state so they're experiencing the zone where they can have a maximum performance. And so we try to figure out what are all the different factors that would help them to get into that state. We've also talked about the term IZOF, I-Z-O-F, which is the individualized zone of optimal functioning. So somewhere on that continuum between being in a state of a coma to being in a wild frenzy is the perfect, think of it like an arousal state, the perfect level of arousal for that particular individual to have an optimal performance. So though it does vary personality to personality, it also varies sport to sport if we're talking about sport. And so a golfer would not want to be in a wild frenzy, not in a coma, but in a calm state. Sometimes football players, basketball players might want to get all pumped up, be closer to the other end of the spectrum. So as sport psychologists, we're trying to study and analyze the different factors and then predict the outcome. And if we are to see that it's going to have a less desirable outcome than we'd like, how can we manipulate the factors to produce a more desirable outcome? And so along those same lines, we also learn about the inverted U hypothesis that McGrath really spent a lot of work on. And the inverted U hypothesis, that upside down U, again, we're trying to connect the relationship between arousal states and the performance outcome. And so again, this is just a theory, just a hypothesis. Not everybody agrees with it. But what it's saying in its theory is that if an athlete or an exerciser is almost in that state of a coma, has no arousal, then he or she will have a suboptimal performance. But as they get more pumped up, as the level of arousal increases, their performance is enhanced to a certain point, which is right at the tip of the curve. If they get overly aroused, get in that wild frenzy, the performance is going to decline. So anytime we see the inverted U hypothesis, we're trying to show the relationship between those factors and the outcome, and then manipulate it if we need to do so. We learned before about trait versus state. Here, this chapter on arousal, stress, and anxiety, we see the terms state anxiety and trait anxiety. As we learned in the chapter on personality, if it's trait anxiety, this means that most of the time you get worked up about things. So what it says right here, trait anxiety is a behavioral disposition where the individual perceives as threatening these situations that are not threatening at all. And so they just feel they have no sense of control. Whereas state is also dubbed situational. So most of the time, let's say you really aren't nervous or anxious, but certain situations would create that feeling of apprehension. But that would be state. So that's more dynamic and changing. So then we talk about cognitive state anxiety, and this is like moment to moment changes and in your worries and in your negative thoughts. And then state somatic anxiety. Somatic means there's a physical response to if you have these negative thoughts and you're worrying and thinking this is going to have a terrible outcome. Physiologically, your body reacts to that stress and to those negative thoughts. So that's the somatic part of anxiety. It shows in this chapter certain state and trait anxiety measures that we can do, so you can go in and do those assessments. And then I want you to understand the 4-stage process, the stress process. So if you want to turn to that, that's on page 81. And so Stress occurs when there's a substantial imbalance in what is being asked of you and what you think are your abilities to be able to have a successful outcome. And so let's start with stage one. Stage one is environmental demands. Environmental demands. And so these demands can be both physiological and psychological. So we can apply this even in the classroom, an academic environment where you're feeling a demand. I did the pretend pop quiz, and a lot of you were just freaking out that day. So if you felt that you were not prepared to do well, that there's this demand, you need to do well. I told you we only have X amount of time to do it. An athlete will go to a competition and there's some pressure, there's the demand, both psychological and physical. But the most important part is not that there's a demand, that there's pressure. It's the second stage. It's that individual's perception of the demand. And so two equally talented athletes could go to the same competition. One athlete is considering this as a threat to his ego. He's afraid of failure, whereas the other feels his heart rate going up. He may feel butterflies in his stomach, but instead of perceiving it as a threat, he perceives it as this exciting opportunity for growth. He loves the heart racing, feels fully alive. So we have the environmental demand, we have the individual's perception of that demand. So that's cognitive appraisal. Next is stress response, and there's a response both physical and psychological. And so there's the arousal. I asked you to consider when you had that pop quiz that day. Did you feel your heart race? What were your symptoms? Were you shaky? And so that's the stress response. And then the fourth and last stage is the behavioral consequences. So in other words, the outcome. And so what I believe is that what makes the difference is how you perceive your cognitive appraisal of the demand. So just be sure you understand that four-stage stress process. Then we can get into some of the terms and everything that are continuing in Chapter 12 on arousal regulation. I really like this quote by Rod Laver. He's an old, you may not remember him, tennis professional. And I mean, here's a professional, and this is what he said regarding stress and anxiety and how you can control that. He said, the thing that always worked best for me whenever I felt I was getting too tense to play good tennis was to remind myself that the worst thing, the very worst thing that could happen to me was that I'd lose a bloody tennis match. That's it. And I love the way he puts things in perspective, in the proper perspective. And so all top athletes, of course, have some of that stress. And one of the most effective techniques that coaches use to help their athletes to prepare for stress and anxiety is a term called stress inoculation training. Well, let's back up. When I talked to you about anxiety before, I said the things that create the most anxiety are those things that are unexpected and uncontrollable. So those of you in my on-campus class, when you saw the DVD on Michael Phelps, his coach purposely stepped on his goggles before a competition so that, unbeknownst to Michael Phelps, there was a crack, and when he went to swim, his goggles filled up with water he couldn't see. But what stress inoculation, when you keep simulating stressful situations, what that does is it trains these athletes to be able to respond to adverse situations in a more effective, more positive manner. So regarding Michael Phelps, this had happened. His coach did this all the time to train him, because in order to deal with it, you do need to practice it in your training. So in the Olympics, when he was going for 8 gold medals, in one of his events, it might have been the final one, sure enough, his goggles did fill up with water, and there's a video of it, and he couldn't see a thing. But rather than freak out or have negative thoughts like, well, there goes that gold medal, he counted his strokes, he used certain mantras and phrases, he used instructional self-talk, and he did win the gold medal. But that, when a coach purposely creates a stressful situation so his athlete learns how to positively deal with that, that's called stress inoculation. Another technique that we see in this chapter is progressive muscle relaxation. And it tells you in this chapter how you would go about doing it. So you can read if you like to try it. You can read step by step that process. But basically, what it is in order to totally relax a muscle, you must tighten it up first. And so you would start with the top of your head, tighten up your forehead, and then totally relax it. Go to your cheeks, go to your jaw, go to your neck, your shoulders, all the way down to your toes. So by the time you get to your toes, your entire body is completely relaxed. And fast forward, when we get into the chapter on children and sports psychology, the term that you see on your study guide is spaghetti toes. And spaghetti toes is the children's version of progressive muscle relaxation. Let's see what else I want you to know from that chapter. I think that's all that I'm going to cover for now. Keep it short because I know you all are preparing for the midterm. Don't forget, you have the midterm coming up. You can go online Thursday anytime between 5:30 in the morning until just before midnight. And as soon as you begin the test, you'll have 75 minutes to complete the test. I know you all are going to do great and continue to have a great fall break.